And, a geopolitical chessboard. But here's the catch. The traditional grandmasters, the US, China, Russia, they've basically all stepped back from the table.
Yeah, they've completely left the room in some ways.
Right. And instead, a totally new set of incredibly aggressive players has just pulled up chairs and, well, taken over the game. And they are rewriting the rules in real time, literally playing with the lives of millions of people.
It's a really terrifying image. And honestly, it's a remarkably accurate way to describe what is happening right now in one of the most volatile regions on Earth.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. Today, our mission is to untangle this massive, just incredibly complex web of proxy conflicts happening right now in the Horn of Africa.
And it is complex.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
So to do this, we are grounding our entire conversation in this really comprehensive report from March 2026. It's by the American Enterprise Institute, or AEI, authored by Liam Carr and Michael D'Angelo, and it's called Fault Lines in the Horn of Africa.
Right. And before we really get into the weeds here, we need to make something very, very clear to you listening.
Yes, definitely.
This report covers some highly charged political and military conflicts. We're talking about the Gulf states, Israel, Turkey, and numerous African factions. Our entire goal today is to impartially unpack the facts, the strategies, and the viewpoints presented in this specific report.
Exactly. We are not taking sides here. And we are absolutely not endorsing any political actions or military campaigns. We're literally just here to help you understand the mechanics of this situation.
Just laying out the pieces on that board you mentioned.
Right. So to even visualize this, let's just map it out mentally. We are talking about the Red Sea coast. It's that geographic bottleneck separating the Middle East from Africa.
The choke point.
Yeah, the choke point. If you control this area, you control a massive chunk of global trade. But the reasons why Middle Eastern powers want to control it, well, they've completely changed. The report details this massive shift in motivation from the 2010s to the 2020s.
Yeah, it's night and day. Like if you look at the 2010s, Gulf state involvement in the Horn of Africa was largely ideological.
Okay, ideological how?
Well, it was the aftermath of the Arab Spring.
Mm.
So you had Saudi Arabia and the UAE forming this anti-Islamist coalition. Their main goal was to basically suppress revolutionary Islamism, countering the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood and Iran.
Right, so it was about the spread of ideas.
Exactly. And by extension, they were pushing back hard against countries like Qatar and Turkey, who were a bit more supportive of those populist movements at the time.
So back then, it was a battle of ideas. But then we hit the 2020s, and the script completely flips from ideology to basically pure economic survival.
The world just fundamentally changed over a few short years. I mean, we experienced these massive global economic shocks. The COVID-19 pandemic shattered global logistics.
Oh, yeah, the supply chain nightmares.
Exactly. It exposed the extreme vulnerability of those supply chains. And then Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, which caused catastrophic wheat shortages and really spiked energy prices.
Which is terrifying if you live in a desert.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So for these Gulf states, the battle wasn't purely ideological anymore. It suddenly became this existential scramble for food, energy, and economic diversification.
It's like they used to fight over who got to dictate the rules of the neighborhood watch, but now they're fighting over who literally owns the grocery store and the roads leading to it.
That is a great way to put it.
And because the traditional cops on the beat, the US, Europe, and China have largely retrenched, there's basically nobody stopping them from buying up the store.
The vacuum is immense right now. I mean, the U.S. is focused elsewhere. China has really dialed back its lending due to its own domestic economic slowdown. And, well, Europe is preoccupied with Ukraine.
Right.
So these middle powers are financially equipped to just step in, and they are doing so very aggressively.
And because everyone is scrambling for economic control, the report outlines how some highly unexpected alliances have formed. It's splitting these historical friends into two very distinct camps.
Yes, the two axes.
Yeah, the first group is what the report calls the axis of revisionists, basically the disruptors.
Right. The disruptors are primarily the United Arab Emirates and Israel. And what unites them is that they are highly, quote, risk acceptant.
Meaning they'll roll the dice.
Yeah. They are perfectly willing to bypass international norms, back secessionist movements, and partner with marginalized strongmen to get exactly what they want.
Yeah.
And what they want is strategic depth in the Red Sea and absolute control over trade routes.
Wait, you're dropping a term there that I hear on the news all the time, but I want to make sure we actually understand it. What does strategic depth actually mean for a country like Israel or the UAE on the ground in Africa?
That's a good question. It basically means establishing a buffer zone.
Okay.
For a small nation, if a conflict reaches your actual physical borders, you're already in existential danger. So strategic depth is the ability to project military and intelligence power far beyond your own borders.
Ah, I see.
For Israel and the UAE, having naval bases or friendly proxy militias hundreds of miles away in the Red Sea means they can intercept threats like weapon shipments to their enemies long before those threats ever reach Tel Aviv or Abu Dhabi.
That makes perfect sense. So they're willing to break the rules to push their defense perimeters outward. Then the report outlines the second group, the status quo axis, which is led by Egypt and Saudi Arabia.
Right. And they are described as risk-averse.
Okay, so totally opposite.
Yeah, they back internationally recognized sovereign governments because they view any instability as a massive strategic danger to their own economies. They have these huge long-term economic visions,
Yeah.
like Saudi's Vision 2030, and instability threatens all of that.
Right. And sitting alongside that status quo group is Turkey. But the report says Turkey competes heavily with the UAE and Israel using something called the Ankara Consensus.
Yeah, the Ankara Consensus is really interesting.
Well, I've read about the Washington Consensus, which usually involves Western loans tied to really strict democratic or human rights reforms. How does this Ankara Consensus actually function differently?
It is essentially a fast-track state-led investment model. So Turkey comes in offering these massive infrastructure projects, drone technology, defense deals, but without the lectures on human rights.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, or the heavy bureaucratic red tape that comes from Western institutions. It is highly appealing to African governments who need immediate security and development, but without those conditional strings attached.
Okay, hold on. I have to push back on something else here. Aren't Saudi Arabia and the UAE supposed to be incredibly close allies? I mean, they literally fought a war together in Yemen. How did they end up on completely opposite sides of this geopolitical fault line?
It's fascinating, right? But economic survival often trumps historical alliances. Saudi Arabia currently feels strategically encircled by the UAE.
Encircled? Really?
Yeah. The UAE got a massive head start over the last decade in securing port access and resource contracts across the African coast. And now, Saudi Arabia is frantically trying to catch up to fuel its Vision 2030 agenda.
And that's Saudi Arabia's massive plan to pivot away from oil, right?
Exactly. And Vision 2030 requires massive amounts of critical minerals for tech and green energy, but it also requires absolute stability in the Red Sea to attract global tourists and foreign investors to those futuristic megacities they're building on the coast.
Right. Nobody wants to invest next to a war zone.
Precisely. So when the UAE fuels a proxy conflict that destabilizes the Red Sea, it directly threatens Saudi Arabia's multi-trillion-dollar economic pivot. Former allies become fierce competitors when their survival plans basically collide.
Wow. And if the UAE is willing to break rules and back disruptors to secure its interests, what happens when that attitude hits a really fragile country? Let's map this competition onto the actual conflicts in Africa, starting inland with Sudan. Because the human toll here is just devastating.
It's horrific. We are looking at nearly 3 years of civil war, at least 150,000 dead,
That is just awful.
and 21 million people facing food insecurity,
Yeah.
and 14 million displaced. It is literally the world's worst humanitarian crisis right now.
And this is where the proxy war is most visible, right?
Yeah.
You have the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, which is a paramilitary group that originally grew out of the Janjaweed militias,
Right.
and the UAE is their main patron. The report details how the UAE has been funneling arms and drones to the RSF through places like Chad and Libya. But it's not just a one-way street of weapons. There's a massive financial mechanism here involving gold.
Gold is at the center of it. The UAE legally imported $34.5 billion of African gold in 2022 alone.
Billion with a B.
Yes. But the report estimates they imported another $115 billion in undeclared smuggled gold over the previous decade.
That's insane.
It is. And Sudan is incredibly rich in gold. And the RSF controls many of those mines.
I'm just struggling to picture the logistics of this. Like, how does a paramilitary group fighting a brutal war in the desert securely mine, smuggle, and transport billions of dollars in gold to a global financial hub?
Well, it is a brutal but highly organized shadow economy. So the RSF uses its military power to violently take over these artisanal gold mines.
Yeah.
They basically force local populations to extract the gold.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. Then, using the exact same logistical networks that bring in the illegal weapons, which are often unmarked cargo planes flying out of remote airstrips into neighboring countries, they just fly the raw gold out,
Wow.
and it eventually reaches refineries in the Gulf. Once it is melted down and refined there, its origins are totally obscured. It becomes, quote, legal gold entering the global market, which funds the RSS war machine while boosting the UAE's reserves.
That is just a staggering cycle of extraction. And then on the other side of the civil war, you have the Sudanese Armed Forces, that's the international recognized military of Sudan. And they are being backed by the status quo powers, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. So Egypt has been sending weapons and even coordinating drone strikes with Turkey to help the SAF push back the RSF.
Right, so you literally have Emirati-backed forces fighting Egyptian and Turkish-backed forces on the ground in Sudan. The local conflict has been entirely hijacked by these middle powers fighting for regional dominance.
But Sudan isn't the only powder keg in the report. If we move slightly east, we hit Ethiopia, which is dealing with its own deeply complex internal fracturing. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has been aggressively centralizing power since he took office.
Yeah, and the context here is super crucial. Ethiopia historically uses a system of ethnic federalism.
Right, I see headlines about Tajir and Amhara all the time, but as a proxy for you listening, what does ethnic federalism actually look like in practice?
Imagine a country where the Constitution literally divides the nation into distinct regions based on ethno-linguistic lines. And each of those regions is granted a massive amount of self-rule.
Like U.S. states, or more than that.
Much more. We're not just talking about local mayors. These regions have their own heavily armed regional security forces and the constitutional right to self-determination.
Oh,
right?
oh.
So when Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed tried to dismantle that system to create a stronger, centralized national government, he wasn't just passing a new law. He was demanding that deeply entrenched, heavily armed ethnic groups give up their autonomy and their weapons.
Which totally explains why the blowback has been so violent. The most famous resulting conflict is the Tigray War. They had a peace agreement in 2022, the Pretoria Agreement, but the report notes that a coup in March of 2025 by the hardline Tigray People's Liberation Front essentially collapsed that peace deal.
Yeah, it fell apart. And simultaneously, Abiy is fighting the Fano militias in the Amhara region.
Right, the Fano.
Fano is a collection of ethno-nationalist militias that originally helped Abiy fight the Tigrayans, but then they turned against him when his government tried to disarm them. By January 2026, those disparate Fano groups merged into a massive, unified coalition, which escalated the threat to the federal government in Addis Ababa.
So Ethiopia is dealing with severe internal chaos. Yet somehow, Abiy Ahmed is also projecting massive power outwardly, specifically with the GE, or the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam,
Yes.
which is this massive hydroelectric project on the Nile River.
Massive is an understatement. It's a 5,000 megawatt dam. He is unilaterally filling and operating this dam because he views it as the engine that will make Ethiopia the undisputed regional energy superpower, potentially pulling millions out of poverty.
Right. But think of it like this, to help you visualize it. Imagine someone building a giant faucet on the very real, only river that waters your entire garden.
Yeah.
And not only do they build it, but they flat out refuse to sign a contract promising they won't turn off the pipes during a drought, because that is exactly how Egypt views this dam.
Well, for Egypt, it is a literal existential threat. I mean, 97% of Egypt's fresh water comes from the Nile.
97%.
Yeah. Egypt has explicitly threatened military action over this, stating they will absolutely not tolerate Ethiopia operationalizing this dam without a legally binding agreement on water release during drought years.
Okay, so we have civil war in Sudan, rolling insurgencies in Ethiopia, and Egypt literally threatening to bomb a dam. And the conflict just keeps bleeding outward into the coast because Ethiopia has all this internal chaos, but they're still aggressively trying to project power to the coastline.
Right, because Ethiopia is a massive, rapidly growing country of over 120 million people, but it is completely landlocked.
Ah.
Abiy Ahmed famously refers to this as a geographic prison. Currently, they rely on the tiny neighboring country of Djibouti for over 95% of their trade. Abiy has basically declared that sovereign sea access is an existential right for Ethiopia's future.
Which leads us directly to the breakaway region of Somaliland. So Somaliland operates independently, but is internationally recognized as part of Somalia. In 2024, Ethiopia tried to bypass the central government in Somalia entirely to make this port for recognition deal.
Yeah, a very controversial move.
Right. Ethiopia gets a naval base and commercial port on the Red Sea. And in exchange, Somaliland gets official recognition from Ethiopia as an independent state.
And this immediately infuriated the central government of Somalia and Mogadishu, as it obviously violates their territorial sovereignty.
Sure.
But the situation escalated dramatically when Israel threw gas on the fire. In December 2025, Israel became the first state to officially recognize Somaliland's independence.
Okay, hold on. I'm struggling to understand why Israel cares about a random breakaway region in Somalia. What is their actual angle here?
It all comes back to that concept of strategic depth we talked about. Israel wants a firm, friendly foothold near the Bab el-Mandeb Strait.
Which is,
That's the narrow choke point of the Red Sea. By recognizing Somaliland, Israel is courting an ally that could host Israeli intelligence or naval assets. That allows them to monitor and counter Iranian weapon shipments to the Houthis in Yemen long before those ships ever get near the Mediterranean.
oh, I see. So Israel is willing to fracture Somalia just to get a listening post on the Red Sea. And this is happening exactly as Somalia itself is breaking apart internally. Because regions like Jubaland and Puntland have suspended ties with the central government over disputes regarding direct elections.
Exactly. Somalia is incredibly vulnerable to outside interference right now. But the status quo powers are not just sitting by and letting Ethiopia and Israel carve it up. Egypt and Turkey are stepping right in to defend the central Somali government.
The report details that Egypt actually deployed troops to Somalia, and they did it to replace Ethiopian peacekeepers who were already there fighting the al-Shabaab insurgency.
Which is a bold move.
Very. And meanwhile, Turkey secured the rights to patrol Somalia's coastline.
And that Turkish naval agreement is a massive direct blow to the UAE, who had actually been aggressively negotiating for those exact same maritime rights in Somalia for over a year.
Okay, let me make sure I have this entirely straight. Ethiopia is effectively trying to buy a coastline by offering political recognition to a breakaway state. In response, Egypt is sending actual ground troops right to Ethiopia's border inside Somalia to stop them. I mean, that sounds like a regional war just waiting for a spark.
It is the literal definition of a tripwire. You have Egyptian troops on Ethiopia's border,
Yeah.
an active, totally unresolved dispute over the Nile waters, and Israel and the UAE backing the very secessionist forces that Egypt and Turkey are trying to suppress.
A powder keg.
Exactly. A single miscalculation, a skirmish at the border, a misunderstanding at sea, it could ignite the entire Horn of Africa.
Wow. Okay, we have covered the players, the armies, the ports, and the mechanisms of how these middle powers are actually operating. But let's bring it all together. What is the ultimate prize that makes all this risk worthwhile for these countries?
It really comes down to three things: food security, mineral wealth, and control of global trade. We mentioned earlier that the Gulf states import 80 to 90% of their food.
Right.
They live in desert environments that simply cannot sustain their growing populations. Africa, meanwhile, holds about 60% of the entire world's uncultivated arable land.
Which is wild. And the UAE isn't just buying imported grain anymore. The report highlights they have signed massive land deals in at least 12 different African countries. They are literally buying the soil that grows the food.
Yeah, securing the source.
Mm.
And then there is the mineral wealth we discussed, like with Sudan's gold. Saudi Arabia is doing the exact same thing with critical minerals.
For Vision 2030.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To build the artificial intelligence hubs, the tech manufacturing centers, and the green energy grids required for Vision 2030, Saudi Arabia absolutely needs a guaranteed supply chain of raw materials from Africa.
And finally, there is the Red Sea itself. I mean, 10 to 15% of all global shipping goes through that narrow corridor. Control the Horn of Africa, and you essentially control the logistical jugular of the global economy.
But there is a massive fatal contradiction in the strategies of the disruptor nations. It's the ultimate zero-sum paradox. By funding warlords like the RSF in Sudan or, backing secessionist states like Somaliland just to get cheap gold or a quick port deal,
Yeah.
the UAE and Israel are fundamentally destroying the stability of the region.
Right.
Yet stability is the exact thing they need for their long-term economic visions to actually work.
Right.
You cannot build a futuristic, globally connected, trade-based economy next door to a burning continent that you help set on fire.
It is incredibly short-sighted. So as we wrap up this deep dive, the landscape is pretty clear. The Horn of Africa is no longer just a theater for local historical disputes. It is the epicenter of a new vicious Cold War.
Probably.
It's the UAE and Israel on one side, backing disruptors to grab resources, and it's Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey on the other, trying to maintain the status quo just to protect their own economic survival.
And the AEI report has a very clear conclusion for U.S. policy regarding all of this.
Yeah.
Historically, the U.S. has taken a really hands-off approach in Africa.
Why is that?
primarily because Washington didn't want to upset Middle Eastern allies who are, vital for counterterrorism and military operations in the Middle East itself.
The old don't make waves with your friends strategy.
Exactly. But that strategy has completely failed.
Hmm.
The U.S. can no longer compartmentalize its relationships like that.
So what's the fix?
The report recommends that the U.S. urgently appoint a dedicated, Senate-approved envoy to the Horn of Africa. Furthermore, the U.S. needs to start using its immense financial leverage.
Like sanctions?
Yes, including targeted sanctions against groups like the RSF and their shadow financial networks. The U.S. has to use this leverage to force its own allies to stop tearing the Red Sea apart. They have to step in as a neutral mediator to create inclusive agreements, rather than just letting these middle powers play a winner-takes-all game.
Because if they don't, the consequences are obviously going to reshape the globe. Which actually leaves me with a final thought for you listening to ponder. We've talked a lot about the players and the geography, but let's zoom out. With the US and China currently totally distracted by their own global competition elsewhere, if these middle powers successfully rewrite the borders and the rules of the Red Sea right now, what happens when the superpowers finally look back?
That's a profound question.
Right. Will they find that the center of global trade has already been permanently redrawn by players they used to just view as subordinates?
The whole board could be different.
Exactly. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep your eyes on the board.